Good evening, and thanks for being here. We've just been talking about what we in the Bronx call a crock. It's other places call it bull. These are the 4, until now, top secret memoranda from the Department of Justice, no less, that spell out all the techniques that can be used, how long they can be used. There is no more shameful text that I have ever read, and I've read some pretty shameful texts. It's here for your perusal. I urge you strongly to download it, or at least take a look at some of the pages of this thing, and then take a bath right away, because you'll need to. I mentioned before that I was going to address more the ethical, the moral, the religious aspects of this, but because of my checkered career with the CIA, I will add one comment right up front. You know, if people are looking for an authority to talk about whether torture works or not, there's no better than General John Kimmons, who until recently was the head of Army Intelligence, the whole Army Intelligence of the United States. General John Kimmons turns out to be a pretty gutsy guy, because on the same day that he knew the President of the United States was going to get up before a major press conference and extol the virtues of what he called enhanced interrogation techniques, what he called specifically, quote, an alternative set of procedures, end quote, General John Kimmons called his own press conference 3 hours before, right across the river at the Pentagon. And General John Kimmons said this, and I quote, "No good intelligence has ever come from abusive interrogation techniques. History shows that, and the history of the last 5 years, comma, hard years, comma, also demonstrates that." This was September 6th, 2006. He's talking about the last 5 years, hard years. Now, this didn't stop the president from getting up and saying what he did, lying through his teeth about what we got from Abu Zubaydah and others, which is proven now to have been gotten through benign techniques of the kind that Terence alluded to, not through an alternative set of procedures. But cite that if you would. Look it up. Just search on John Kimmons and you'll find it. And that needs to be said up front, I think. Let me tell you just a little bit of a story. I have 8 grandchildren now. And about 6 years ago, when Claire, who lives in Oakland, was 4, she was watching me on the Lehrer show with her mother, my daughter Kathleen. After the show, she ran up to Kathleen and she said, Mommy, that was Grandpa." And Kathleen said, "Yeah, that's Grandpa." She said, "Well, Mommy, that means the other people are real too." Now, that's cute, isn't it? But you think about what that means, folks. Think about what that means. If you don't know someone in the picture, the other people aren't real too. The other people can be subhuman. We don't even have pictures of what's going on in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan now. Well, at least we had pictures during Vietnam. So I think this is one reason why it's so easy for our troops, and you can perhaps verify this, that they're inculcated with the belief that these ragheads, sometimes called, quote, sand niggers, end quote, are just people to be eliminated, or people to be tortured, or people to be regarded as subhuman. When I was studying philosophy and theology at Fordham, Jesuit University in New York, we learned about a category that was called intrinsic evil. That means always evil, huh? Always. Never allowed. We talked about rape. We talked about slavery. We talked about torture. Never allowed. Now, what are we talking about here? In present circumstances, we're talking about a 12-year-old little boy put in Guantanamo. We talked about 16-year-olds. We're talking about the last suicide. This time the Pentagon didn't describe it as a clever act of asymmetrical warfare. That's how they described it 2 years ago. Suicide at Guantanamo, one of these folks that was being fed intravenously with a big, thick tube through his nose to his stomach. And we're talking about the 17 suicides of our own soldiers. Last year? No, not last year. Last month. May. How many last year? 133. That's what dehumanization does to you, not only to you, but if it's done at your hands. What about this latest news about, because there's not too many children here, so let's talk about rape by instrumentality. Rape by instrumentality. We know this went on. We have testimony from some of the interrogators, some of the MPs and others. And Scott Horton, a very prominent civil rights lawyer up in New York, has written about this. And he said, now I understand. Now I understand. When we tried to get that legislation that would forbid contractors from doing this kind of thing to detainees, as we call them, we had knockdown, drag-out sessions with the White House lawyers. And we couldn't understand, why would you object to proscribing rape by instrumentality? And there was a long silence, and finally they admitted, well, this is part of the bag of tricks, and there are very, very strict federal as well as state statutes that forbid that, and we don't want to put anybody at jeopardy. Can you imagine? That's the kind of thing we're talking about, folks. I was born in 1939. I was alive during World War II. I know what happened. I lived in Germany for 5 years. What did the church say in Germany? Nothing. The Catholic Church said nothing because they had worked out a deal. You can still say Mass if you don't alienate Hitler. Lutheran Church, well, those bishops swore allegiance to Hitler. It was unconscionable, but it happened. And you know what, folks? Is it very different today in this country? Is it so very different? Now, the Presbyterian Church has come out with a very, very strong statement, and I applaud that. I have some questions as to in how many Presbyterian communities it's being preached, but I certainly welcome the fact that that statement is out there. Let me tell you just a little story about a good friend of mine, Bishop Tom Gumbleton. What he, make a long story short, we invited him to give a talk after he had succeeded in getting the Catholic bishops to include in a formal statement that the sanctions against Iraq, having already done away with 500,000 Iraqi children below the age of 5, that they were, quote, unconscionable, end quote. Okay. Now, that's a pretty good word, okay? And it was very rare that you could persuade all these 260 or so bishops to go along with that, but he did. So we had him a couple of weeks later, and after he was talking, one of the young women in our congregation said, now, Bishop Gumbleton, tell me, what kind of reaction have you got from the government? Have you heard from the White House on this? And I said to myself, oh, damn. Because I knew what the answer was. And Tom stepped right up to the plate, and characteristically he said, look, the government treats us as 270 private citizens who might or might not vote for the Republicans or the Democrats. Now, we represent 70 million faithful throughout this country. So we have some potential power. And if we had gathered all our local bishops and all our pastors and said, you will preach this word, you will preach the fact that sanctions are unconscionable to your communities, then it might have made a difference. And the young woman said, didn't you? I says, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. And what he didn't say, and what I have seen in my pulling out my hair about this, is that the churches, the institutional churches, by and large, by their silence, are riding shotgun for the system.